So, we have had a look at this field called game theory, which is studied by many disciplines, and it is basically an analysis of how rational agents, when they are acting in their self interest, what kind of outcomes will be achieved. So, the key features there are rational agents, which means that they do not make silly mistakes or things like that. They always take the best decision which is in their own self interest. So, let us look at some popular recreational games. Games have always been fascinating for humankind, and starting from childhood we all learn to play different kinds of games. We begin with chess, which has been in some sense the most popular of all games. If you go to the Wikipedia page on chess, you will find some information. The precursors of chess originated in northern India during the Gupta Empire, where its early form in the 6th century was known as Chaturanga, which is a word which comes from Sanskrit. This translates into 4 divisions. So, chess was always used as a strategy game, you know, that if you are 2 generals or 2 kings, and then how can you this thing make use of whatever resources that you have, how can you lay out your armies and things like that. So, the 4 divisions, meaning infantry, cavalry, elephantry and chariotry, which involved into the modern pawn, knight, bishop and rook respectively, essentially. Then from India it went to Persia, and around that time itself, 600, the name became Satranj. So, in Hindi, if you see, it is still called Shatranj. The spelling is different, but the pronunciation is the same. And you might have seen a famous film by Satyajit Ray called Shatranj Ke Khiladi, which was based on a story by Munshi Premchand. So, Shatranj is what we normally call it India, and Shah is the word for king in Persian. So, when you were threatening the opponent's king, then it became a rule in chess to utter the word Shah essentially. And if you manage to subdue the opponent's king, then it became Shah Mat essentially, which means in Persian that the king is finished essentially. So, this word Shah translated eventually in English to check. So, if you have played check, then you know that you have to say check when you are attacking the opponent's king, and if you manage to finish the king, then you say the king has been checkmated essentially. So, you can see that the word has come from there. The word check comes from Shah and the word checkmate comes from Shah Mat. Then the game reached Western Europe and Russia by at least 3 routes, and around 9th century this thing, and it was introduced into the Iberian Peninsula, which is the Spanish region, by Moors in the 10th century. It was described in a famous 13th century manuscript covering Satranj, Backgammon and dice. So, this manuscript talked about these games which were popular in the 13th century essentially. Buddhist pilgrims, Silk Road traders and others carried it to the far east. So, it went to Europe, and from there it went to the east, where it was transformed into a game often played on the intersection of lines of the board essentially. So, rather than within the square. So, if you have seen a Go picture, which I will show you at a moment, but in chess you place pieces within the squares, but in a game like Go you place them at the intersection. So, you have coins and you can place them at the intersection. So, it kind of got transformed into something like that. So, then there are games like Chinese chess and shogi are the most important of the oriental chess variants. Some terminology which has been around in for chess. So, on the left column you have Sanskrit, then Persian, then Arabic and then English. You can see the top row. In Sanskrit the king is called Raja, in Persian it is called Shah, in Arabic also it is called Shah, and in English we say the king essentially. In the second row, in the Indian context, we used to use the term mantri, which stands for minister and which is wazir in Persian, but in the European version it became the queen, and in fact the queen is the most powerful piece in the chess in terms of mobility and things like that. And then there were other, as you can see, uh, that the Ashva, for example, stands for a horse in Sanskrit, and it became the knight in the European this thing. And Rath stood for the chariot, uh, and it became Rook in Persian and Rook in English essentially. Some colloquially people use the term elephant for Rook essentially. So, chess was considered to be a game of intelligent people, and there is in the history that we might have discussed when we were looking at the history of AI. There was this well-known chess playing Turk essentially, and this guy Kempelen, he is supposed to have invented this mechanical robot which could play chess to impress Empress Maria Theresa of Austria essentially. And as we have discussed during the introduction, that it was not a robot, but there was a human being, diminutive human being hidden inside the contraption, who was actually making the move essentially. So, it was a mechanical illusion, but you can see that in the history of AI that we discussed, that these kind of things were desirable essentially. Then in the real world of programming, Arthur Samuel, who was one of the attendees at the Dartmouth conference as we had seen, where the term AI was coined, he wrote the first checkers playing program in 1952 on IBM's 701 computer. Now, there is a rumor that IBM was so much interested in checkers that the fact that they chose a 32-bit word as their basic word length was because in checkers there are 32 pieces. So, remember if you know the game of checkers, it's played on a standard chessboard of 64 squares, but it's played only on one color square. So, either black or white, whichever the case may be. His goal was to explore how computers to learn essentially. He was interested in that can a program learn to play better essentially. So, machine learning in that sense is as old as AI was, and he felt that if computers could learn from experience, then there would be no need for detailed and painstaking programming. In these programming languages were in their nascent stages, and programming was not for everyone. His checkers program improved as it played more and more, and when we discuss chess, we will see that it improved by learning what is called as a better evaluation function, and eventually it beat its own creator. So, that is some fear which has existed in the Western world for ages. Uh, for example, in the novel called Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, that how artificial creatures can overcome humankind, and in the modern times, people like Stephen Hawking have also endorsed this fear that maybe AI will overcome humankind and things like that. These fears are of course largely unfounded. So, let us look at the chess programming essentially. So, it started off as you can see in 1912 when Torres builds a machine that could play the certain kind of ending, which is king and rook versus the king essentially. Claude Shannon, who we know for information theory, he wrote a paper programming a computer for playing chess. Alan Turing was also involved in the first program for playing a full game of chess. John McCarthy, who was the organizer of the Dartmouth conference, he is credited to have invented this alpha beta algorithm, which we will study a little bit later, but other people have also been credited for that essentially. So, Bernstein, who participated in the Dartmouth conference, he wrote the first program to play full chess at IBM essentially. And then there were other programs essentially. Mac Hack 6 was another one. Around 1968, the British Grandmaster David Levy, he made a bet that no computer program will beat him within 10 years. So, luckily for him, by 1978, computer chess was not good enough to beat him. But interest in chess was growing, so computer chess tournaments started. So we had the North American Computer Chess Championships and the World Computer Chess Championship, which was won by a Russian program called Kaisa. The first microcomputer chess playing machine. So machines were getting also smaller around that time. So we were moving from mainframes to PCs and so on. And then there was progress in the 70s. So a program called Chess 4.0 is the first chess computer to be successful at a major chess tournament. As I said earlier, David Levy won his bet because Chess 4.7, which is a successor of 4.6, could not beat him. This thing, but as you can see, the score was 4.5 versus 1.5, which means maybe 3 games were drawn, or maybe one was drawn and one he lost. It's not clear to me. A Fredkin Prize was established for beating the reigning world champion, essentially in 1980. The Cray machines, which were those powerful machines at that time, had their own implementations, and the first computer to beat a master in tournament play was the Cray Blitz program, essentially. Then people turned their attention to hardware, and they said that if you have 64 PCs, why can't we have 64 processors sitting and analyzing the chess positions and so on. Then there was a program called High Tech by Hans Berliner, who himself was a well-known chess player. It won against a match against a grandmaster Denkert, 3.5 versus 0.5. So it was a 4-game match. Then a program called Deep Thought became powerful in the late 80s. Shares first place with Tony Miles, who was a grandmaster, ahead of the former world champion Mikhail Tal. But it lost two exhibition games to Gary Kasparov, who was the world champion at that time. The name Deep Thought was taken from this famous novel by Douglas Adams, in which a machine had this name, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is real fun to read, and I would recommend that. And then chess programs started becoming better. So in the 90s, you can see a chess machine, Gideon, this thing wins the 7th World Computer Chess Championship. But that was of course between the computers, but it beat mainframes, supercomputers, and special hardware. So it means that on the algorithm side, chess was making progress essentially. In 1994, a program called Chess Genius beat Gary Kasparov in one game, but in a non-blitz time limit game essentially. Then came the program Deep Blue, which became famous. In 1996, it lost a 6-game match to Gary Kasparov, but in 1997, it finally beat Gary Kasparov essentially. And the inventors, who were from IBM, they were awarded the Fredkin Prize that we had spoken about earlier. By then, the machines were becoming more and more powerful. Kramnik, who was the world champion, he draws an 8-game match against Deep Freeze. After that, Hydra defeats Michael Adams 5.5 games to 1, so which means Adams could only draw 1 game out of 6. Then the undisputed world champion Kramnik is defeated 4-2 by Deep Fritz, and by then chess playing programs had become so powerful that nowadays when you look at the grandmasters who are playing chess tournaments, they always analyze their moves based on this thing. Of course, they can't use the chess playing program while they are playing the game, but between games they analyze using this thing. And as you can see here, Topalov prepares by sparring against the computer blue gene. So by now, this was in 2010, and in 2022, no one can beat a chess playing machine, or at least the best machines. So this is a game of Go, which was also considered to be, it's a game which is very popular in the eastern part of the world, China and Korea and Japan and so on. It's played on this 19 by 19 board, as you can see, and as I had pointed out earlier, here the pieces are placed on the intersection of those squares and not inside the squares, but that's just a matter of convention. It has been considered for long to be a very hard game, and people had thought that machines will never be able to beat humans in this game. The complexity comes because of the size of the board essentially. As we will see, our game playing programs that we will study, they will construct a tree and search the tree. So, the branching factor of the tree depends on what are the moves that are available to you. We will do a little bit of analysis as we go along, but the main thing is that Go is played on a 19 by 19 board, which means that the number of choices available to each player. So, there are two players, one is playing black coins and the other is playing white coins. In general, the goal of the game is to capture territory. So, eventually that player which can capture more territory wins essentially. But because the board size is so huge, people thought that Go is going to be a hard game essentially. In fact, people used to say that it has aspects of Zen thinking, because Go masters, just like Zen masters, they would ponder over the board and then suddenly come up with a move. Essentially, it did not look like the kind of the way that we play games like chess, that we imagine if I play this, my opponent will play this, and then I will play this, and then my opponent will play this. They said that they are basically looking at patterns essentially. So, it's a Zen like game, and they thought that very difficult for machines to do that. But as you probably know, in 2016, this program called AlphaGo, which was written by a company in UK called DeepMind, and there were about 25 odd or 30 odd people who were working on this program for a long time, and in 2016 uh, it beat the world champion Lee Sedol, whose picture you can see on the right, in a 6-game match essentially, which was covered extensively by media. And if you go to the DeepMind website, you can see somewhere a link to the film that they have made on this particular match essentially. So, each match is kind of shown as a very dramatic event. It's quite exciting to watch. What about other popular games? And when we say popular games, now we are also focusing on the fact that we are talking about implementing programs to play those games. So, Scrabble has been also very popular. It's a word game which most of you should be familiar with, in which 2 or 4 players score points by placing tiles bearing a single letter. So, you have these tiles and each tile has a single letter on a board which is divided into 15 into 15 grid of squares essentially. So, it is also a largish board. It has rules that you may be familiar with, that you have single letter scores or double letter scores or triple letter scores, or single or double word scores or triple word scores, and things like that essentially. So, the tile must form words. So, they must be recognizable word or legal words in something like a crossword fashion. So, you can have one word, for example, you can have sun like this, and then you can have something like nest here, and you can have something like vase here. So, they must be all connected with each other. So, this is one word and that is another word and this is the third. So, you can only make a word which connects to the existing word, and so there are rules that I am sure you are familiar with, but they must come from a standard dictionary or a lexicon. In fact, Scrabble has its own dictionary. Scrabble is a trademark now essentially. Now, this guy called Brian Shepard in 2002, he wrote this program called Maven, which could beat the best human beings in Scrabble. And you can imagine that it's not so inconceivable that computers will play Scrabble well, because they have access to this whole lexicon, and then they can do this trial and error, that at any point each player is looking at 7 letters. So, they have a rack of 7 letters and they have to see which word they can form, and this kind of combinatorial search program can do quite well. And so, it is not surprising that the best Scrabble players are computers, and in particular this program called Maven. Then there is another popular game called Backgammon, which is played. It's quite popular in the US. It's a game which is played on a rectangular board like this, and they have things like this, where one player starts from this side and has to go round like this. So this is a start for one player, this is a start for another player. The other player starts from this side and has to go around like this and eventually reach their destination. So they have a few coins that they have to move, and then they play. It's played with dice. So people in India would recognize a game like Ludo, for example, or Snakes and Ladders, in which the dice decides how much you can move. And if you have multiple coins, then it's also a strategy game in the sense that you have to decide as to which of the coins to move, essentially. So it has stochastic moves based on the throw of the dice, and a similar game called Chaucer had been described in ancient Indian literature. So if you have read the Mahabharata, you would know that uh, Yudhishthira gambled away his entire kingdom and including himself uh, in this game of dice. It's also called Pachishi. It was popular in the Mughal courts of India. And Tesario, he wrote this program, and this was in the mid 90s, called TD-Gammon, essentially. This TD stands for temporal difference learning. So this is a form of reinforcement learning. And essentially what happens is that because of the fact that you make a sequence of moves and the outcome is only known to you a little bit later when the game ends, there is a difference between your move and their effects, essentially. And there was this reinforcement learning strategy called TD learning, and this program which employed that, and it's called TD-Gammon, and it's also the best player this thing. So it learned this strategy by playing 300,000 games against itself. This was in the early 90s. Another popular game in which people have attempted to program machines is poker. So poker is a card game in which each player is dealt 5 cards and essentially bets on whether their holding is better than that of other players. So when you say better, it basically means statistically improbable, essentially. So for example, if you get 4 aces, then it's a very improbable event and it's considered to be better than if somebody has got let's say 4 kings, for that matter. So there are various patterns which, and there is a hierarchy of patterns, and um, it basically depends on the draw of your cards as to, if you get good cards, then you have, I mean, you are just dealt good cards. There is nothing much you can do about that. But the strategy goes beyond calculating odds. Are my cards better than what the other player would have got? And deception happens to be a key component in poker, essentially. So players need to bluff on poor hands so that eventually they will be able to gain on good hands. So if you have a reputation for bluffing, then even when you are betting on a good hand, opponents might think you are bluffing and they might, donate some money to you. It's a game which involves uh, points which are converted into money. A straight player would not be very successful in the game. So in 2019 at CMU, they wrote this program called Pluribus, which defeated leading professionals in 6-player no limit Texas Hold'em poker. So there is a particular kind of poker game called Texas Hold'em, and this program could beat the world players, which means that it had kind of figured out how to make false bids or bluff, essentially. It did by doing a limited look ahead because it's played with a fixed set of cards and the options that your opponents can have get limited, essentially. And it also learned by playing against copies of itself, essentially. So the last game that I want to talk about is the game of contract bridge. It's a game where machines are still not better than humans, essentially. So it's a kind of a challenge still. It's an open challenge. So it's a card game in which on a table 2 partners play against 2 opponents. So you have a table and there are 4 players. Typically they are called north, south, east and west. In a tournament format, there are many tables, and depending on what is the format of the tournament, the competition is between, not so much between players on the table, but on with players which are on a different table. So, for example, if this is another table, so let us say this has got these players south, east and west, then the competition is not so much against your opponent. So, north and south are partners uh, and east and west are partners. So, but the competition is not so much against them. The component, this south is actually competing against the south on the other table, because they all play the same cards or they are dealt the same cards, and they it goes from table to table. So, it is really as to how well you do with the cards. Now, it is a fairly complex game. It has got two phases, one is bidding and one is play. Both phases involve formal communication. So, there are well designed coding systems which code the meaning of bits. Then you have to make inferences, you should know logical reasoning, you should be able to do planning, and deception is also a part of this game essentially. And not to speak of probabilistic reasoning, because you can't see the other player's cards, so you have to work with probabilities. Several groups have worked on bridge playing programs since the 1980s, and in 1996 the American Contract Bridge League established the World Computer Bridge Championships, and it has been running every 2 years or something. But we are still waiting for programs which can play better than humans, and the reason for that it's a complex multiplayer game essentially. Just a quick comparison of bridge versus chess, because chess is really the most popular game essentially, whereas bridge is not as popular amongst people as chess is. But if you look at a bridge deal or hand as it is called, every time the cards are dealt fresh, and the number of possible different deals is of the order of 2 raised to 27. So, practically every deal is a new deal, which if you compare with chess, you always begin with the same starting position. Your pieces are lined up and the opponent's pieces are lined up, and so much so that there are books written on how to play the chess. So, there is a very famous book called Modern Chess Openings, in which different initial strategies, opening strategies are discussed essentially. Another key difference between chess and bridge is that in chess you can see the board and you can see what moves the opponent can make. In bridge you can't see what the other player is holding essentially. So, even if you could see the cards of other players, a game tree would still have 10 raised to 21 leaf nodes essentially. Whereas chess has the same starting position, the same goal position, that you have to checkmate the opponent's king. Whereas in bridge, the goal is set in the bidding phase, and that has to be achieved in the play phases. So, it is a much more complex game, and as I had said earlier, a bridge match may happen with uh, across with two teams. So, there is one red team as you can see here and one blue team. So, in one room in which nobody can see, and that is why it is called the closed room, the red team is sitting north and south. In the open room where kibitzers or watchers are allowed, the red team is sitting east and west, and the blue team is kind of symmetrical essentially. So, they are competing against each other. So, I will end about talking about different games by highlighting the fact that if you are interested in a big challenge, then bridge is a game for you to work on. Next, we will come to simpler games like chess, which are called board games, and we will see how they are played.